So here we're going to look at AP Bio OpenStax chapter 38, which is talking about biodiversity. Okay? And so we need to keep in mind that ecosystems change over time, and therefore the biodiversity will change over time. Biodiversity is a measure of variation at the ecosystem level. We've previously talked about genetic diversity, and now we're talking about biodiversity. In other words, how many different species are in an area? How biodiverse is it? Species richness is the number of different species represented in an ecological community or region. Relative abundance is how common or rare a species is compared to other species. And again, biodiversity will change over time. So we talked about how Antarctica, back in like Pangea times, used to be a lot more tropical. There was probably more biodiversity then than there is now. Okay, so biodiversity can change just as an ecosystem can change. And remember that organisms are looking to gain and preserve energy in order to increase their chances of survival and reproduction, or looking to, right? Are evolved to, we can say more accurately, gaining and conserving energy in order to increase chances of survival and reproduction. So changes at the primary producer level will impact the other trophic levels. Why? You should be able to pause the video and think about that. Hopefully you're able to pause the video and think about that and answer that out loud. If you haven't, you should now. Okay? If there are changes to if there's less primary producers, then there's less energy for everything else. So for example, the end Cretaceous mass extinction event happened. And so this is where there was a sudden mass extinction of 3/4 of the plant and animal species on Earth. Geologists estimate and evolutionary scientists estimate that this was approximately 66 million years ago. And almost all animals weighing more than 25 kilograms, including all the dinosaurs, went extinct. Okay? And the theory, the last time I checked, is that the geological record from this time shows really high concentrations of iridium, which is much more common in asteroids than in Earth. And this also correlates with the evidence of a large asteroid impact in the Yucatan Peninsula around this time. So the thought was there was a huge asteroid and all the dust and everything blocked sunlight, so really limited photosynthesis. So most of the plants died, and so there wasn't enough plant mass left to keep the large organisms alive, so they all went extinct. Okay. And so biodiversity can change, and that's an example of a mass extinction event where biodiversity would have gone down fairly suddenly. Biodiversity is not homogeneous. Certain areas have more biodiversity than others. And we can think about this in latitudinal gradients. The closer to the equator, the more biodiversity there is. The exact causes of this are still up to debate. Maybe more energy. It's debatable. But the closer to the equator, the more biodiversity there is. And there's also hot spots of high biodiversity that are threatened by human adaptation. And these areas contain a lot of endemic species. In other words, species that are only found in that area. So if their habitat is eliminated, like let's say where number 8 is in California, if those forests are eliminated, then all the species that are only found in that area are also eliminated. And so it's not just getting rid of the species that live there, it's getting rid of those species from the entire world by destroying that habitat. Okay? And so this shows that, like, in terms of amphibian species, there's some areas with way more amphibian species than elsewhere. And you can see it tends to be closer to the equator. Endemic species are species that exist in only one geographic region. So if an ecosystem becomes less biodiverse, it is less healthy and less resilient to changes in the environment. And we can also say we don't want to lose species, hopefully from Christian understanding, because species are created by God, right? And without going into too much detail, why should we care about other species? Well, they were also created by God. If we go back to Genesis, right? So this idea of, well, if the species die, it doesn't really matter. This is, threatening, blah, blah, blah. Look, I'm not saying, like, that you should be aligned with a particular political party in your home country, but we should at least, and I'm not saying that the only concern you have in life should be protecting the environment, but to say that we shouldn't care about protecting the environment or care about protecting other species, you can make a pretty strong case as not a biblical stance, right? Back in Genesis, we got a pretty clear admonition to be stewards of the earth. And I'm not going to talk about that too much here, but we'll do some faith and science that goes over that later after the AP exam. So if an ecosystem becomes less biodiverse, it is less healthy and less resilient to changes in the environment. Less species means less genetic diversity and therefore less opportunity for adaptations to develop with changing selective pressures. So just like if there's, I kind of bungled the wording here, but just like if there's less genetic diversity in a population, so it's less resilient, if there's less species overall, then the whole ecosystem is less resilient to change and will be damaged more by change over time. Okay? And so if there's a diverse community and something happens, like let's say there's a warm year and then a cold year, the community as a whole is more stable. Whereas if it's only one species, depending on the change in the temperatures, maybe the total population and the health of the community goes way up and down, which isn't good for all the other species also affected by that. Some species or factors are perhaps particularly important in maintaining biodiversity in an ecosystem. So this is like the primary producers we talked about. If the primary producers go out, that means the ecosystem is in grave danger, right? There's also keystone species and other key abiotic and biotic factors such as precipitation and temperature, which is why when we talk about climate change, if the climate changes even a little bit, it can have really drastic negative effects on an ecosystem. So primary producer importance, this should be pretty clear. They provide all the energy for the ecosystem, and they're also critical in habitat formation. We can think about like trees in a forest, or a tropical rainforest, or like coral reefs. They are providing the habitat too for all the fish and all the aquatic organisms. Then we have keystone species, named after the keystone like on the top of the arch. What is a keystone species? A keystone species is a species which has a disproportionately large effect on its natural environment relative to its abundance. In other words, plants aren't keystone species because they're very abundant. A keystone species is a species that there's not that many of relatively, but they're really important for the environment. Okay? So like for example, the sea otter is a predator of the sea urchins. Without the sea otter, the sea urchins will just grow out of control and mess with the whole ecosystem. So in that ecosystem, the sea otter is a keystone species because it being around is really important, and there's relatively not that many of them. Removal of a keystone species can lead to ecosystem collapse. So another example is a beaver. Beavers make dams, and there's whole ecosystems around beavers making the dams. Like dams as in like they cut down trees and they put them in there and it changes the waterways to slow moving water. And there's whole ecosystems of like where the dams are and other species that thrive on the dams. And if the beavers aren't there, there's no dams, and then those other species might not be there either. Or you watch that video about how wolves change the rivers. And this is a picture of before and after reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone Park, and how different the wildlife looks, for example. Because before the wolves, there were way too many elk, and so they were eating all the plants, and so the plants couldn't grow up. And so then, kind of like how even if you've been at Beersheba, they talk about how you need some plants to grow up and then other plants can grow under them and things like that. If there's overgrazing, then the ecosystem doesn't develop appropriately. Well, the wolves prevent overgrazing, and so it has all these positive effects on all these other organisms. So the wolves, there's not that many of them, but they have a big effect, and hopefully you watched that video that I asked you to before in the previous lesson. If you didn't, look up how wolves change rivers. It's a really cool video. So keystone species often act like wolves do through trophic cascades. Trophic cascades are powerful indirect interactions that can control entire ecosystems, occurring when a trophic level in a food web is suppressed. For example, a top-down cascade will occur if predators are effective enough in predation to reduce the abundance or alter the behavior of their prey, thereby releasing the next lower trophic level from predation. So like the example I just gave, the wolves are in essence limiting the elk or limiting those consumers of the plants so that the plants can develop more appropriately. Removal of a species may change organization of an ecosystem, leading to drastic change. Now, we can say an ecosystem collapse, that if you remove a keystone species, it's an ecosystem collapse. An ecosystem collapse does not mean that literally the entire ecosystem dies. An ecosystem collapse means that the biodiversity drastically decreases and that it's bad for the community. Okay? So again, an ecosystem collapse does not mean that everything dies. Rather, the loss of a keystone species has a dramatic effect on the environment. Think of it in terms of if A, then B, and if B, then C. The same sort of logic as a multi-step signaling mechanism involving gene expression. Okay, so like the example I gave about how wolves can change rivers, and hopefully you should have watched this video. This is the third time I'm telling you. If you haven't watched it, you gotta watch it. Okay, so, and you should be able to answer this video question. Why are wolves in Yellowstone Park considered a keystone species? Here's another video. You should pause and watch this one about how lions are keystone species. I'm not just having you watch these videos, it's like, wow, cool video, let's waste their time. No, it's because, especially I think for some of these ideas like for ecosystems in Unit 8, when we're talking about different examples, you need some different examples of it and not just the concept to really understand what it is. So please take a minute and watch this video about how lions are keystone species, because they are controlling for other populations, such as the coyote population, hyenas, and they're also controlling for preventing overgrazing in their areas, which allows the plants to work correctly, and they have massive implications on how wildlife interacts around water, and all these sorts of things that video talks about, okay? Now, unfortunately, us humans don't always have a hug and warmy relationship with the natural world that we're in. Humans can have negative effects on the world around us. And there's different ways that humans can negatively affect the environment, including habitat loss, overharvesting, invasive species, and climate change. There have been 5 mass extinction events in the last 500 years, and we are currently in the 6th one, okay? So we as humans are causing a mass extinction in the life around us. Isn't that nice? And you can think, how is that possible? How is that possible? Like, this species will never go extinct. Well, even the species you would never think would go extinct might. So, like, you might think pigeons, there's no way, right? Like, you see so many pigeons, for example, in Dakar, and you might think that species of pigeon would never go extinct. There's a great example in North America where someone had this quote, you can go ahead and read it, saying, we got to be careful. They are not invincible, even though you might think they are, okay? And so we have I'll get back to the pigeons in a minute. We have all these species and all these predicted species, right? And we're losing a lot of them. And it's very sad. It's very sad. We're losing a lot of species. The background normal rate of extinction in quote-unquote normal times is estimated based on like evolutionary and geological science in terms of dating things and how often species are lost, is about 1 extinction per million species per year. But currently we're at somewhere between 100 and 1,500 times that rate. Okay, so we're losing species way, way faster than the quote-unquote normal rate. So it is a mass extinction event. How are species being lost? One way is habitat loss. If a species, especially an endemic species that only lives in one area, if that habitat's destroyed, that species doesn't exist anymore. So these are 2 examples of endemic species found in only one area. Okay, the rainforests of Borneo and the rainforests of Sumatra, which are obviously here, Sumatra and Borneo. Don't you know where Sumatra and Borneo are? I hate to say I am so geographically ignorant. I could have not told you that. Okay, but if those forests are destroyed, then that orangutan and that's a tiger, right? Where does it say? Does it say it's a tiger? I think so. That'd be really embarrassing if that's wrong. If those forests are lost, those species are gone. Okay, and so then here's another example where whole habitats can be lost, for example, over farming. So people create more and more farms, and then we're losing those species. And I just want to throw in there really quickly, okay? So, because I could talk about this a long time, but in areas where the entire forests are being cut down, not like just a little bit, but entire forest being cut down. Here's my 30-second thing for you. You might think, but people have to produce food to live. Yeah, but it's not average Bobby Joe that is benefiting from this. I mean, as often as, that gets into world affairs, big and powerful people are not necessarily living their lives at night thinking about how can I benefit, the poor. Unfortunately, that's not always how it goes. And so here's my 30-second thing, in case you're aware. If you think, what about the average Joe who just needs to feed his family? Average Joe who feeds down his family is not creating the image on the right here, okay? The images on the right are caused by massive industrial groups of people that are cutting down huge swathes of like rainforest and such. For example, this is happening in Brazil, and it's really sad, in huge amounts of rainforest. I don't know if this has been changed in Brazil, so if pardon my political ignorance if this has changed, but it's happened the last time I looked for a while. It's just one example. And when the rainforest is lost, it is really bad, and it's just benefiting a few people, because often the people who are hired to cut down the rainforests, and then the people who actually are doing the farming are not making very much money. And often it veers on, if not is outright, actually like farming slavery, okay? And so like farming slavery, and this around the world is actually kind of strongly tied to this destroying whole forests and replacing them with farms. And then if the bigwigs are to move on to somewhere else, then like the people who have lived there for hundreds of years or more and have their lives built around the ecosystem, well, now the ecosystem is destroyed. And so you're actually destroying the lives of the people that have lived there and making it harder for the average person to carry on their lives than it was before. So that's just, in case you're wondering about that, you can read about that. But, it's a really sad topic. It's like they're destroying huge amounts of forest, and it's not actually benefiting many people, and it's killing all these animals. And it's sad, okay? Another way that species can be lost is over-harvesting. So if we're not careful, if people aren't careful, then like, for example, fish can go extinct by hunting until there's hardly any left, and then they're all dead. An example of this is the passenger pigeon in America. There used to be at least 3 billion passenger pigeons in America about 200 years ago-ish, and the last one was killed about 100 years ago. They were just all shot down. So no population is safe, really. No population is safe. We can't just say, well, they're invincible. No, they are not. We need to protect them. Here's a video of overfishing and what steps we should do to prevent that. I encourage you, please pause this video and watch this video. Pause this video and watch this video. Please take a second to watch this video on overfishing. Okay? All right. Next, we have invasive species. These are species that have been intentionally or unintentionally introduced into ecosystems in which they did not evolve, and they can mess with the original ecosystem and have negative consequences and cause species to go extinct. So, for example, there's snakes in numerous regions of Guam that went in, and they're like, I believe they're killing a bunch of birds on the islands and things like that are not evolved to even look out for them, and the snakes are just out of control. There's an example in North America, actually pretty close to where my wife and daughter are right now as I record this, in the area called the Great Lakes of North America. And there's Asian carp, which have been introduced, I think accidentally, and you should please pause and watch this video. Please pause and watch this video, and at least go to the part, even if you don't watch the whole thing, you should go to the part where you can see how many Asian carps there are in the water is insane, because there's no natural predators to control for their numbers. And so they're just taking over the waterway and messing with the local, killing the, like, basically niching out of taking the place of all the other species of fish and kind of reducing their numbers or even eliminating them, and messing with the whole livelihoods of all those people who also fish and all of that. Or even if it's a virus or a bacteria or a fungi or something like that that introduces into an ecosystem, and it can kill the organisms that live there. And I think this is an example of that. Okay? And then there's climate change as well, which has a negative effect on biodiversity. And we don't talk about climate change too much in this class or explain it too much, but it's leading to all sorts of ecological threats, particularly habitat loss. And for example, we're going to lose most of our coral reefs in your lifetime. Probably most coral reefs will die, and all the fish on those reefs will probably mostly die, and all these species will be lost. And it's sad. And that is the end of your AP Bio lessons. So, what did you learn from here? You should learn that biodiversity is not constant. It can change over time as the environments change. And you should know what keystone species are, and that keystone species are really important to the environment and also primary producers. And you should know that humans are having some really unfortunate and negative effects on the environment. And sometimes, honestly, we don't care enough about that. And we should, It's not the only thing that happens in life that you should care about, but it should be a concern. If we believe that there is a God who created this world and we're trashing it, that's not good, right? So we'll talk more about that later, but when we do some more faith and science after this exam. But hey, this is the last video, so good luck.